All right, welcome to part two of our video over the recent past up to the present. In our last video, we discussed the 1990s going into the 2000s and President Bush's presidency, which was dominated by the War on Terror, 9/11, the Great Recession, and Hurricane Katrina. And remember that we left off on the Great Recession, which took place in 2008 but was largely created by long term events of over speculation and particularly the real estate marketplace. Um, and as we will see, the Great Recession had shown us that this economic crisis had flaws in our system. And unfortunately, it was shown for the rest of the American people as well. Um, so so anyway, as this recession was happening, the U.S. had entered another presidential election. Bush had just finished his second term, and the new Republican candidate was John McCain. Um, so John McCain in 2008 ran against the Democratic candidate Barack Obama and his vice president Joe Biden. Uh, the Obama was eventually elected as president of the United States, right? Obama himself was a former law professor and community activist, and Obama became one of the first. He became the first African American candidate to ever capture a nomination for a major political party, and eventually winning the presidency, which was a huge thing. Uh, so Obama eventually became the president of the United States in 2008, and he inherited this war on terror and this huge economic crisis. President Obama's first term was marked by domestic affairs, especially efforts to combat the Great Recession and pass his national health care law. Uh, Obama came into office as the economy continued to deteriorate, and he continued by doing what essentially Bush did, which was a bank bailout, which began with Bush but was carried on into Obama's campaign. Uh, but this huge economic stimulus plan to provide government spending and reignite the economy really was not favorable for many individual Americans, because during this we see how the government is bailing out big businesses and the banks, and they are profiting during this time, while the individual American continues to suffer under a stagnating and economy which was facing growing unemployment. So, despite Obama's dominant electoral victory in the 2008 election, his national policies were fractured because of this new growth of the Republican Party, and especially the Tea Party, which became a catch-all term to diffuse the movement fiercely, and it was represented by fiercely conservative and politically frustrated American voters, typically wider, older, and richer than the average American, flushed with support from wealthy backers and clothed with iconography of the founding fathers. The Tea Party activists registered their deep suspicions of the federal government, especially Barack Obama at this time. So the Tea Party became one of Obama's major rivals, and this carried on and further polarized, like I mentioned, this polarization of American politics, where we see two extremes: either you're Republican or you're Democrats, and battle lines are being drawn, and both sides were essentially not willing to listen to each other. And this is sadly a fact that has continued on into American politics today. And so one of the biggest pieces of legislature Obama passed was the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which is deemed Obamacare. Presidents since Theodore Roosevelt have striven to pass some sort of national health care program, but failed. I mean, even in the 1870s, under the monarchy of Prussia and the unified Germany, they had national health care, right? This idea that every citizen should have access to affordable care. But it wasn't until President Obama um, he adopted a more conservative model for subsidized private care, which eventually became known as Obamacare. While opposed by conservative protests, Obama's healthcare reform narrowly passed through Congress. So eventually, it was passed, and it was signed into law in March 23rd of 2011. It abolished pre-existing conditions as a cause for denying healthcare, scrapped junk plans, and provided state-run healthcare exchanges, allowing individuals without healthcare to pull in their purchasing power, and also offered states funds to subsidize and expand Medicaid, and required all Americans to provide proof of health insurance plan that measured up with the government's established standards. Those who did not purchase would eventually pay a penalty tax, and those who cannot afford insurance would be eligible for federal subsidies. The number of uninsured Americans remains stubbornly high, however, and conservatives spent most of the next decade attacking the bill. Healthcare remains a very divisive political topic that exists today, and we're not really going to get into that debate of should we or should we not have it. But as it exists today, there are this is how it came to pass. This is what it is, and even today, Democratic candidates are trying to push for more structured national health care that supports all Americans, especially during hard times like today, during this pandemic where millions of Americans are sick and going without insurance, right? Um, so, anyway, Barack Obama in 2012, he won a second term by defeating Republican Mitt Romney, the former governor of Massachusetts. However, Obama's inability to control Congress and the ascendancy of the Tea Party, Republicans stunned the passage of any meaningful legislation by Obama. So even though Obama was a Democratic candidate, um, he was not able to pass every single thing he wanted to and hoped to achieve during his presidency because of the already polarized Senate and House during his presidency, right? And this growth of this new conservative movement surrounded by the Tea Party. So we see this polarization in American politics that especially exists today, where Democratic candidates refuse to vote for Republican measures and vice versa. Republicans refuse to support Democratic legislatures. So there we see a growth in political deadlock that has occurred for really the past 2 decades, um, and is only getting worse and worse as we go on. Um, so Obama was a lame duck before he even won re-election. The gridlock government came to represent an acute sense that of American life, where politics, economics, race relations had grown stagnant. So this brings us into our next term, economic stagnation, right? So a lot of fun things that have been happening in the past several decades. So while corporate profits climbed and stock markets soared, wages stagnated and employment stagned for many years during the Great Recession. By 2016, statistically, the average American worker had not received a, a raise in almost 40 years. So that's crazy. I'll just read that again. By 2016, the statistic average of an American worker had not received a wage in almost 40 years. And also, the average worker in January of 1973 earned an average of $4.03 an hour. Now, adjusted for inflation, that wage was about $2 more an hour than the average American earned in 2014. And sadly, this continues to exist today. Isn't that crazy that the average worker in 1970 made $2 more an hour than the average worker in America today? Also, we see that the federal minimum wage remains at 7.25, not adjusting for inflation, as the cost of living in America continues to increase, as healthcare becomes unavailable for many workers, and we see a growing divide between the very rich and the very poor. Bet- all the while, between 2009 and 2013, 85% of all new income in the United States was went to just the top 1% of the population. So 1% in 2013, the 1% of the population gained 85% of all new income. We see this growing trend in the past several decades where most of the wealth in the country goes to the very top 1%, while the rest of the Americans are stagnating and suffering economically. That economically, in many cases, the average American is worse off than they were several decades ago, which is just a crazy thought, right? Thinking that we are always progressing. Well, these economic factors show the opposite, in fact, that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Um, and today we have a decrease in full-time jobs available in America and a growing number of part-time low-paid work that does not offer benefits. This is largely because companies can hire multiple low-paid part-time employees instead of hiring people with higher wages, because that means they would have to pay them a salary with benefits, and it would cost them more than if they would just hire a couple of part-time workers. Now it's common to see people working multiple part-time jobs, just trying to get by and unable to get full-time employment. And that's just one of the sad facts of what's happening in America today. But this has occurred since this 2008 recession. We see the majority of wealth in America going to the very rich, while the rest of Americans are stagnating, right? Not receiving any increase in wages, uh, remaining at the same low level jobs, just on average, right? And in the past 20 years, we have seen corporations get larger and larger and larger. We have major corporations like Amazon, which handles online shipping, grow into a multi-billion-dollar company. But in recent news, especially during this pandemic, we see its profits are soaring even more. Right? People can't go to stores and instead they were uh, relying on Amazon. The average Amazon worker is working harder than ever and they're ununionized. Remember that I said that they tried to get unionized under the one worker and the worker got fired, and they are working under suboptimal and potentially hazardous conditions. And that's just an example of the modern day workplace in America that is a growing problem that has been growing for the past several decades. Also, we see technology companies like Microsoft and Apple skyrocketing and dominating the market as well. So we have billionaires making more money than the rest of the country combined, which is just a crazy thought. Also, I mentioned before that airlines are being controlled by fewer and fewer businesses, and that the average ticket price continues to grow. Right. So just to show this, this is the consolidation of the U.S. airline industry. Right. So we can see that American Airlines purchased many of these smaller airlines. Delta is also a large one, and United. This means that if you go for a airline ticket, you only get a choice of a handful of airline companies, right? And all these companies are collaborating with each other in order to keep their prices high as we see more and more seats getting put on these airplanes, but the price remains high, you know. And this is just one of the byproducts of this growing corporate America that's happened in the 21st century. And then on this left side, we could see that 10 companies control over more than 50 brands, right? And this is their food that if we want to go to a restaurant or something, it's only really controlled by 10 major companies, aside from small businesses, which are growing even smaller. Um, so we're getting into this time in the 21st century over the past 20 years where these major companies are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And media, Disney, for example, has assumed a near monopoly on the film industry, or at least a majority portion of it, where we see that Disney is buying out its competition and becoming a um, one of the major producers of media that we consume. Generally, we see most of the economy being controlled by fewer and fewer hands, giving us as purchasers fewer and fewer options of where we go to, where we get our food, where do we buy our plane tickets, which media we consume. This is only being controlled by a handful of companies, and this is growing uh, more and more as we progress. Um, we find ourselves in a position that if you want to fly somewhere, you only have a handful of choices. If you want to watch Game of Thrones, you have to buy HBO, which is also a part of AT&T. And T. And if you want to watch a Disney movie, you have to pay for Disney Plus. If you want to buy things online, you go to Amazon, who has kept their prices low and run down competition. So Amazon's kept its prices low for years and years, and ran at, in some cases, a loss, but in order to keep their costs low and buy out their competition, right? That you would rather pay for Amazon, which is cheaper, than go to some other online retailer. So anyway, in summary, the rich are getting richer at the same time where the average American is declining economically, that their standard of living is declining, that their wages are not the same as they used to be. Um, and we see that all this money that is going to corporations, going to the rich, are being funded into politics, right? That in order for the rich to get richer, companies donate billions of dollars into politics. And we see that in the past 20 years, especially in presidential races, it's being more about money. Who could create the most funds for their campaigns, and who pays for those campaigns is private interest groups. And these interest groups have their own private interests saying, like, hey, I will give you some money and we'll help you get elected as president, or we'll get you elected into public office. But, when you're in public office, that means you'll have our back, right? So we have a handful of rich companies being able to manipulate the political system through money. Um, and where do so this is just one of the sad facts of modern politics today that has only grown in the past 20 years. um, so now moving away from politics, I'll mention that what's happening in America internationally. When I began part one, I mentioned that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. So from 1990 all the way up to about 2010, the U.S. was a unchallenged superpower, economically, militarily, with expanding global influence. However, since 2010, we see a rise in other nations who are competing with the U.S., such as the European Union, Russia, and especially China, who have all become global forces in their own right. In 2000, for example, China had a gross domestic product of around one-eighth the size of the US's GDP. Based on the growth rates and trends, analysts suggest that China's economy will bypass that of the United States soon, within the next several years, if not decades. But still, the China's economy is growing exponentially, which has put a strain on the U.S.'s economy, as well as we are facing the reality that we are no longer the big guys on campus anymore, right? That we have some competitors. Um, so, like I mentioned before, throughout the semester, most of the goods that we consume in our country today come from China. Our technology is being produced in China. The products that we use every day, our clothing, a lot of it comes from China. They're all being produced in China, where workers can be paid extremely low in order to keep their costs low. And because these clothes are so cheap, right? People are more willing to buy cheap clothes that are produced in China than producing more expensive clothes that are made by smaller companies in America. So we see this growing trend. Also, we see that companies are moving out of the United States. Um, we are losing industry. This industry is going into other markets, other locations, like in Asia. So and meanwhile, in Russia, Vladimir Putin's leadership has extended its influence into Eastern Europe. And evidence suggests that in 2016 election, Russia may have tampered with the election. Um, all the while, all the while these things are happening, impacting America. That for this time period between 1990 and 2010, America had no major international rival. But past 2010, after this Great Recession, and because of these long-term economic factors, we see that the U.S. is facing international economic competition. All the while, climate change has become a permanent and major topic for public discussion and policy in the 21st century. One of the major byproducts of the Industrial Revolution that we mentioned since the very beginning of our class has been that the Industrial Revolution has caused the devastation of the environment. The mass consumption of fossil fuels over the past century has caused massive pollution and economic devastation and made a human made mass extinction of animals and habitat across the planet. All of this because, and a large reason of this is because of the drastic increase in CO2 emissions, massive deforestation, among many climate issues. Scientists agree that if we do not change the way we get our energy, it may permanently impact the Earth as the Earth continues to get higher and higher because of greenhouse gases. In recent years, governments have tried to step up and address climate change, and EU countries, especially Germany, have pushed for solar and wind energy. But that's only a small percentage of the CO2 emissions created in the world. Meanwhile, the U.S., one of the largest CO2 producers in the world, is making slow waves and change to push for clean energy. Now we see a increase in solar and wind and uh, kind of energy and hydroelectric, but at the same time, these are going slower compared to places like Europe. And especially in China, we see a huge, because of its industrialization, we see a huge increased spike in CO2 emissions. And that's why places like Beijing, people have to wear face masks all the time because they just live in CO2 pollution. Um, so climate change continues to be one of these major topics up for debate in U.S. history for the past 20 or so years, and it remains a growing issue that future politicians will probably have to make some difficult decisions on. This leads us all that into the 2016 election. Now, I'm not going to get super into this mainly because I don't want to talk politics. But we could see that there are many issues being debated during this election. Um, so Donald Trump has this slogan, "Make America Great Again," focusing on the conservative Republican policies that were rising during the 21st century. That this new right was criticizing the Democratic Party and trying to really push for things like tax cuts, prohibiting illegal immigration, um, and among many other issues. On the other side, we have Hillary Clinton, where in this election we see majority of Americans viewed each candidate unfavorably. That majorities in both parties said that they just wanted to vote for their party's candidate. It doesn't matter who the candidate was. Um, Now, that's not to say that many people did believe in Hillary Clinton. Many people believe in Donald Trump, but the vast majority of America, according to the textbooks, dates that there was this major focus on not voting against the party you don't like and voting for the party that you do like, despite the candidate that they've chosen. Um, and going into the 2016 election, we see that incomes were still frozen, politics were gridlocks, race relations were tense, and headlines were full of violence, such as frustrations which only challenged a larger sense of stagnation, which upset the traditional political allegiances. But eventually, as we know, right, Trump has become president. In 2017, uh, one of the first things they did was pass a tax to continued cut the redistribution of American wealth towards corporation and wealthy individuals, right? So following that economic trend of the new right, he has pushed for a cut of taxes to the very rich in hopes that it will trickle down to the American people. But eventually, I mean, as the facts show, that doesn't really happen, as the majority of wealth in the country remains for the very rich, while all this wealth barely even trickles down to the average American as incomes continue to stagnate. Um, so so moving away from America's widening economic inequality, uh, let's discuss some of the major social impacts of the past decade. And really, what the textbook focuses on is millennials. So millennials, these people born in, I believe, the very late 80s, all the way up to like the end of the 1990s, early 2000s. Um, this makes up millennials, right? My generation and probably some of your generations as well. But I believe that this may be a little outdated. That I believe that millennials and Generation Z, right, the generation below my generation, that was born between 2000 and I guess the present, uh, they are the ones who are have been really pushing for social change in America. These generations have grown up knowing mostly nothing but the internet and modern technology. I mean, I certainly don't remember a time without the internet. I was very young when my parents first got their first personal computer, and we had a dial-up modem that made like this. Many of you probably don't even know this, but it just made this awful sound every time you tried to connect to the internet, right? But still, I've grown up for most of my life with technology, and many of you have as well. And by 2010, smartphones have become a widely used and easily accessible for many Americans. Because of this, we see an explosion in things like social media. For example, when Facebook first came out in the early 2000s, it only had like a couple of 100,000 people, but now that number has skyrocketed to the billions. Social media like Facebook, Reddit, Twitter have all come to become a dominant part of many of our lives. And we see that massive growth with the rise of social media. We see a massive growth of miscommunication as the newspapers used to be known as the Fourth Estate, which was historically for the past 200 years the source of truth and trying to keep the public informed about what the government's doing, what's happening in the world. The Fourth Estate newspapers as we know it is coming to an end. Now we see things like 24-hour news outlets and social media dominating our information. On one hand, we get more information immediately instead of waiting things like the next day, like newspapers. Um, but on the other hand, we see news outlets have become largely misinformed and oversaturated, mainly focused on viewership instead of focusing on the truth. And we see that things like televised news programs are very much so divided politically. Um, that one side is just criticizing the other political side with other political views, outlooks on things. So we see this polarization in American politics shining through news as well. Um, One of the things I hope you take away from this class is the importance of research and information in order to make informed decisions. Um, but we'll get back into that in just a little bit. Anyway, like I said, social media has become a huge part of most of our lives. And the growth of social media amongst younger generations have made a massive social impact in the United States over the past 2 decades. One of the major social changes that have really happened in the past 2 decades is a growing acceptance of LGBTQ communities. Remember that in our previous lectures, homosexuals, the gay community in particular, have been targeted and in many cases shunned from a society in America. Uh, for example, when we talked about the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the gay community in particular fought hard for acceptance, but it wasn't until the 21st century when with through the help of social media and young people in particular, these groups gain more rights under the law. Millennial attitudes towards homosexuality and gay marriage reflected one of the most drastic changes in popular attitudes in recent years. After decades of advocacy, American attitudes shifted rapidly. For example, in 2006, the majority of Americans told the Gallup pollsters that gay or lesbian relations was morally wrong, right? So this was only in 2006. But prejudices against homosexuality plummeted, and the greater public acceptance of coming out opened up the culture in 2001. And so in 2001, 73% of Americans knew someone who was gay or lesbian or bisexual. In 1983, that number was only 24%. Um, Gay characters, in particular, gay characters with depth and complexity, can be found across the cultural landscape. So we see that in 2001, 73% of Americans said that they knew someone who was gay, lesbian, or bisexual. And this is a huge change compared to 1983, where only 24% said they did. So we see a growing acceptance of homosexuality, which was vastly different than the "don't ask, don't tell" policies of the 1990s. We see a growing acceptance of this as it becomes more commonplace in America. Then in June of 2015, the Supreme Court ruled the 5 votes to 4 votes Obergefell versus Hodges that same sex marriage was a constitutional right. Nearly two-thirds of Americans supported the position. This was a huge achievement for the gay communities. But as we go forward, over the past 5 years, the LGBTQ communities have continued to gain more public acceptance. One of the main things being pushed now is with gender, and that gender itself is a social construct, and that there are many non-binary people, for example, who are pushing for more general acceptance and understanding in America. So we've seen this evolution fueled by social media and this interconnectivity of modern technology, helping to push forth this modern age of new LGBTQ rights. and growing social acceptance, which is a huge thing. And this is really being pushed by younger generations such as Generation Z and millennials, um, and especially in many young people now, even more so than that 2001 poll shows that they probably know more people part of the LGBTQ community than before, which is a huge advancement compared to what we talked about historically with those things in the recent decades. All right, so um, in many aspects, we're in uncharted waters with understanding gender and sexuality now. And I believe lots of it has to do with the growth of technology and information, as well as younger people who grow up now possibly knowing multiple people who are part of the LGBTQ communities and have a better understanding of what is of this compared to older generations. So we're seeing greater advancements, especially in this area of society. Now, like I mentioned before, the introduction of the first Apple smartphone in 2007 has allowed us to be more interconnected ever with social media like Facebook and Twitter, and people having more access to smartphones and internet and technology in the palm of your hand. So historian, I find this pretty interesting. Historians in the next few years will be able to look at this point in time and sort of and like we're in right now, and cite tweets from Donald Trump or memes that we find on the internet. It's crazy to think that one day in a history class we will analyze memes like what's posted today as a primary source, but that day is coming. It's coming soon. That I know it sounds funny, but the point of primary sources is to understand how things are at a certain point in history through someone else's eyes. This is a primary source is any piece of information that is produced at the time that was taking place, right? So and memes are a perfect representation of this. Um, I mean, now we have tweets of current events and memes being created every day, reacting to one bit of news for another, reflecting public opinion. Things not only have power over swaying public opinions today, but they're very interesting. This interesting concept that we may be able to study this information in the future. Think of the political cartoons that I've showed in our previous classes in the 1800s, right? That these are like 150 years ago. These are cartoons that are being drawn for newspapers, and they were produced to be informative of current events, what things are happening, but also critical of them. And it shows that, and the reason why they were funny to the people at the time is because it mattered, that it reflected some sort of current attitudes about that event today. Um, and just like the political cartoons and newspapers in the 1800s, memes are going to show future historians, future people studying the past, what popular attitudes are going were at that given time. And we see that these things change almost day to day today, right? Um, I mean, recently there are tons of coronavirus memes, and you'll see them everywhere. And this makes sense because we're living through this. And you think that people 20 years from now will come to understand toilet paper memes? Um, we'll have future historians to examine these toilet paper memes to sort of understand this massive panic that was taking place during the coronavirus and all that fun stuff. Let's look at these memes real quick. Um, when you we see this when you leave your family and go get supplies, and you see Katniss Everdeen from the Hunger Games. So she's making this great sacrifice by going out during a pandemic, probably collecting toilet paper. all while risking her life. Um, so that's a little dramatic. But also you see this other meme, which is essential workers, which is this sad cat and an extra $0 an hour. That's those essential workers who are working during this hard time, and they're not getting compensated, largely because of that stagnation in the economy that we were talking about, where workers are making lower wages. I know it's not as funny to explain jokes, but just so you guys can understand it. But there are tons of power in social media and technology. As newspapers fade and TV viewership go down, the main source of news and information is going to come from our phones or our computers. And this has happened for really the past 2 decades. This growing uh, thing of our computers or phones becoming our main source of information about the world. Because of this, we have tons of news that is little research, that has this little research attached to it, being shoved in our faces at all points of all times of day. And two, we see that we are getting bombarded with this information more and more. So we're seeing misinformation being printed more than ever before, and we only get small clips of it as we scroll through our feeds, right? This means that social media now has tremendous power and over our modern society than it did in recent years. Um, and there's a lot of good and bad in this stuff, right? That we have access to all this information, but where does this information come from? There's a lot of misinformation out there, and that's why it's important to do your research and look these things up. But there's my point is that there's significant power in things like memes, but also there's significant power in things like social media. And it became a testament to the power of social media as platforms such as Twitter, the Twitter hashtag, pushed things like the hashtag Black Lives Matter became a rallying cry for protesters, and counter hashtags such as All Lives Matter and Police Lives Matter for critics, right? So we see on both sides of this hashtags being used as political commentary over what needs to change in society. These hashtags have led to marches, protests, and calls for social reform, along with outcries for many Americans who criticize those things taking place as well. Um, Another social media phenomenon that has been taking place in recent years is this hashtag Me Too movement, which began as a magnification of an outrage towards the past sexual crimes of notable male celebrities, before injecting a greater intolerance towards those accused of sexual harassment and violence into much of the rest of American society. So basically, uh, recently, in part because of the Me Too movement, many women are coming forward to tell their stories of abuse and hoping to prevent it. And on one hand, you have groups of people saying that this is a good thing, women are coming together, people are coming forward to mention their past harassments to try to prevent it. But also, on the other hand, you have people who are criticizing this, saying um, that uh, that we should not have to try to not step on anyone's emotions and stuff, that we are going a little too far with this. So there's both sides of this issue, and that's why I said about this counter hashtag thing. In response to this Me Too movement, it has inspired many documentaries like the Surviving R. Kelly documentary on Netflix, of women from across the country, and particularly in Atlanta, who have come forth to tell their stories of abuse as well. This Me Too movement has sparked a lot of social controversy in the past few years as well, especially as people coming forward with President Trump's early presidency in 2016. So it's interesting to see how social media is going to carry us into the future. It definitely has a lot of power, and it has shaped these previous social movements So it's going to be interesting to see where that takes us as well. But I'm not going to speculate on that. So, on one hand, we have a very progressive looking movement amongst younger Americans who, at this time, are more accepting of gender, sexuality, and race. Um, but on the other hand, we have this growing uh, right wing conservative movement that has only gained more power since Ronald Reagan's presidency in the 80s, uh, who are making a call for making America great again by sticking to its core values, such as tax cuts for the rich and big corporations. Um, and also another issue that America is going to have to face, and that it is facing, is the issue of immigration. Uh, and this is showing most apparently this political divide amongst younger generations. There's this growing acceptance of immigrants, while one of the core policies of the Trump administration has been blocking illegal immigrants, mainly through building a wall across the U.S.-Mexican border. So this debate over immigration is very divisive and represents this political deadlock that exists in our country today. Uh, so lastly, I want to quickly mention the current state of things, how history has brought us up to this point. Uh, Currently, we're in a pandemic, yes, but this pandemic has shown that there are cracks and imperfections in our system, especially in the area of employment and healthcare. Unemployment is over 17%, which is the highest since the Great Depression. Millions of people are out of work, and people who are barely hanging on from their stagnating wages, living paycheck to paycheck in many cases, were in the past month fired from their jobs. And because we linked healthcare with employment, we see that many people who are losing jobs because of this pandemic have also lost their health insurance and healthcare as well. Um, Also, we see that small businesses are closing while large corporations continue to keep wages low as the economic divide in America continues to grow wider and wider apart. Even if the virus magically goes away tomorrow, the economic damage is done, and it shows the cracks in the system that's taken place for the past decade. Um, and it will take many years to recover, probably just like the 2008 Great Recession. But we're seeing a massive shift in society as well taking place, such as working from home has become more popular. Things like Zoom, right, is huge, and people are seeing working at home as a viable option for the future, figuring out how it works. Also, we have things like movie theaters, which have been in decline for the past decade. Uh, it might just go away faster because movies that were going to be shown in theaters are now being just made for purchase online, making movie theaters irrelevant. Why pay all that money for a movie ticket for your family when you could just buy the movie itself for cheaper? Uh, Also, during this time, we see things like online shopping going up, like in Amazon. And I believe that Instacart during this pandemic has increased its profits by in its usage by like 600%, which is a crazy number like that. So also over the last decade, we see things like online college courses gain popularity. But during this pandemic, it has shown us that online learning can be a potentially more convenient and, in some cases, more successful uh, option compared to face-to-face classes. Um, so for good or bad, the world's changing. So I hope that this class has made you think about things, uh, that understand that things just don't happen out of the blue and for no reason. That history can help us understand how we get to the current state of things. So I just want to say I've enjoyed getting to know each one of you throughout the semester. I wish that we could have had this last meeting face to face. But I wish you luck on your final and success going into your life. If you have any questions before the semester ends, please contact me by email. If not, good luck on everything, and I'll see you later. Bye.